Jesus is crucified in Jerusalem. And then his immediate disciples go out and come back to Jerusalem to preach that message on Pentecost. This is ground zero. There are people who would have seen Jesus' crucifixion, and they're going around to the scene of the crime saying, he's resurrected.
In this video, Wes Huff explains the truth surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection. Was the crucifixion just a myth or a real event in history? Wes breaks down the evidence, eyewitnesses, early testimonies, and historical facts, showing why the story of Jesus stands stronger than any legend. Discover how God's justice, love, and renewal are revealed through the cross and why it continues to change lives today. Let's watch.
Hey guys, my name is John. Thank you for your what you've shared here tonight. I wanted to get into the as has been discussed a few times already tonight about how the Gospels were written like in the 2nd century BC, AD. Also very likely, as someone who has experienced a lot of rumors going around about myself and just seeing how quickly word spread, like even in schools and my jobs and everything, people just like spread rumors like extremely quickly. What's the likelihood that, Jesus were saying that, take a big cross and follow him, that just somehow just became a thing which everyone was like saying, and then through Chinese whispers of sorts, it just becomes like, he died on the cross, and then
I appreciate that
Christians
question.
would go along with it just like Paul.
So is it just this rumor that developed? Jesus said one thing, but over time it develops, and maybe the crucifixion is a later invention. What do you think?
Yeah, so this is what we sometimes refer to as mythological drift within historiography, that as time goes on, you get these apocryphal and hagiographical, which the stories that start to pop up. I think what some of the things that we see within the Gospels in particular is that we often look at them and we think that there's a embellished nature because they talk about things like miracles. All you have to do, though, is read some of these other Gospels that I referenced in terms of the Gnostic Gospels, and actually you find what
real
true embellishment is. There's one of my favorite stories is a story about Paul, where he is walking down the road and he finds a lion who has his mane caught in a thicket. And the lion is, clearly uncomfortable, and so he releases the lion from the thicket, and the lion is very appreciative of this fact, and so they're walking down the road, and Paul is preaching the gospel to this lion. And so this lion is just so moved by the message that he's heard that he receives the gospel and comes to faith and is baptized. And they part ways, and then later on, Paul finds himself in the Colosseum. And in the Colosseum, who happens to walk out? The good old Christian lion. Now, this is embellishment. This is what we see and can say, okay, like there's something going on here. And in fact, compared to a lot of these stories that we find in the later centuries, the Gospels are actually very matter-of-fact. And this comes across in the way that they're communicated. Why do I not think that mythological drift is taking place? I do not think that it's taking place because we see so many instances where, say, for example, Jesus is crucified in Jerusalem. And then his immediate disciples go out and come back to Jerusalem to preach that message on Pentecost. This is ground zero. There are people who would have seen Jesus' crucifixion, and they're going around to the scene of the crime saying, he's resurrected. There could have been people who would have said, okay, let's go check the tomb. We saw him die. We know he was buried. We can fact check these things. And yet, that's continually what they're doing. They're going back to places where if you wanted to make things up, you wouldn't go there. And it's in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. Now, Luke does this and John does this very well, where they will name people in a way that they don't necessarily have to.
I agree with Wes Huff. We could doubt every historical detail, and skeptics will always find something to question. But it's precisely this faith, this careful consideration of the evidence, that leads us to trust the accounts of Christ's death and resurrection as they were delivered to us. By weighing the facts and acknowledging eyewitness testimony, we move from doubt to belief in the reality of what truly happened.
I believe it's Luke who says that, Simon of Cyrene has two sons, and one of them is named this. And he does that because what he's doing is that is an ancient form of citation. It's most likely that some of these characters that are kind of background referenced are individuals who are well known within the early Christian community. And the authors are saying, don't believe me? Go ask them. And so there are two layers of mythological drift in. One is embellishment, and the other is, what's that? Sorry?
Invention.
Invention, yeah. Does this communicate that the author's actually trying to do their due diligence in the first audience, being able to actually verify what is going on? And I think within kind of the narrative story arc of something like where the disciples are preaching and communicating this message in terms of people being able to actually have understood and fact-check those things, and the names and places and people that they're describing that could have kind of tipped off someone in a very tangible way to say, I don't know about that, but let's go talk to so-and-so because they may very well have more details on this within a time frame that amounts to the memory, the early eyewitness memory still living within the lifetime of people who knew Jesus and people who knew Jesus.
And I think maybe there was just a couple of factual statements in the question that was asked as well that might be worth clarifying, just on the dating of the Gospels. It was the 2nd century AD this is the thought where they come from. But the Gospels that we have in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are all 1st century Gospels, which no critical scholar is going to contest. And you would certainly say the arguments for at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, being pre-70 AD, I think are far stronger than the arguments that they come after 70 AD. And so you're talking within living memory when these things are actually being penned. And there's a statement in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul makes, this creed that he quotes there in verses 3 and 4 and 5. And scholars will point, critical scholars, even from the Jesus seminar back in the 80s and 90s, and they'll say, look, these date to within 3 months to 5 years after the resurrection of Jesus. The early Christians claimed that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared. And so that's a very early reference to the crucifixion of Jesus, rather than just some later development.
Which is not something we have for the vast majority of any other ancient individuals within history. So I mentioned, we do have good source information for individuals like Tiberius, but if we're talking about someone like Alexander the Great, our earliest comprehensive biographies of Alexander the Great come about 750 years after Alexander the Great. And that doesn't mean that they don't contain source material about what Alexander the Great was actually like, but this is the norm. This is the norm for ancient characters. The fact that we have some biographies, never mind 4 biographies, all corresponding and giving things like undesigned coincidences, is actually unheard of in ancient source historiographical information.
Christ's death and resurrection are the cornerstone of the Christian worldview. The historical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and early writings all point to the reality of these events, giving faith its foundation. Understanding how these facts were preserved brings us from doubt to belief, showing the truth and significance of Christ's sacrifice. If this inspired you, subscribe to our channel for more insights.